In my past life, my wife jumped into the river due to postpartum depression, leaving me and our newborn child to depend on each other. My Linda's mother, fearing I couldn't take care of the child alone, suggested I marry her younger daughter, my sister-in-law. But a sister-in-law, no matter how close, is still a stepmother. For the sake of my child, I refused. It wasn't until 10 years later, on Memorial Day, that my deceased wife reappeared with her first love. Ethan is actually our child, Frank's and mine. Now that he's grown, we should come back and reunite with him. Only then did I realize my wife had faked her death to be with her first love. After they got together, she couldn't have any more children, so they wanted to reclaim Ethan. I had been played for a fool, raising their child all these years. I opened my eyes to find myself back on the day my wife faked her death. This time, I didn't refuse Linda's mother's request. Only after agreeing to marry my sister-in-law, Shirley, did I fully accept that I had been reborn. Looking around the funeral home at the white cloth that hadn't been taken down, and Susan Miller's portrait at the front, the hatred inside me almost overflowed. I wished I could stomp Susan Miller's portrait under my feet. But I held back, knowing everyone believed Susan Miller had died of postpartum depression. If I were to trash her funeral home now, people would think I had lost my mind. In my past life, Susan Miller developed postpartum depression after giving birth. She left the child for me to raise, and then, when I wasn't paying attention, she jumped into the river. It was Frank Chen's mother, Linda Lee, who found her shoes by the river, and I learned Susan Miller had jumped. I was heartbroken, blaming myself for not taking good care of Susan Miller. After refusing my Linda's mother's request to marry my sister-in-law, I single-handedly raised my son with great difficulty. Fortunately, he was a sensible child who always ranked first in his class. Just as I felt gratified and proud of my son, believing I could face Susan Miller in the afterlife, she suddenly appeared on Memorial Day. She was wearing a sophisticated evening gown, arm in arm with a tall, muscular man. I recognized him instantly as Susan Miller's first love, Frank Chen. They looked radiant and glamorous, while I was a mess, weeding Susan Miller's gravesite. Peter, Ethan is our child, Frank's and mine. He's all grown up now, and we're much better off financially. It's better for a child to be with his biological parents. As for you, I'll give you some money to repay you for your efforts over the years. That's when I realized I had been a fool for 10 years. I was so angry I almost vomited blood. Plus, it was drizzling on Memorial Day, and the mountain path was slippery. In my rage, I lost my footing and fell from the hills. Clenching my fists, I stared intently at Susan Miller's portrait. Susan Miller, you're good. I'll be waiting for the day you return. 2. I endured a long 10 years. During those years, I held my breath, fueled by a single thought. To achieve that goal, I worked even harder to raise my child. People in the small town laughed at me for being foolish, saying a child only needed to be fed. Once he was grown, he could be sent to a factory to earn money for the family. Nothing could be more suitable. But I didn't believe it. In my previous life, I had raised Ethan so well. There was no reason I couldn't raise my child well this time. In those 10 years, I also relied on my memories to make money continuously, accumulating a substantial fortune. With my unwavering dedication, my son was accepted into Stanford University's early entrance program at the age of 9. Countless media reporters flocked to interview me, wanting to know how this rural man had raised a prodigy. But I rejected all interviews and continued to live as before. Until Memorial Day arrived that year. My son accompanied me to visit the cemetery. On the way, we encountered many people from the small town. They had changed their usual disdainful attitude and began to flatter us. No wonder Linda wants to marry her second daughter to him. I used to say 2 sisters married to the same man, which, let me tell you, is quite a story, but Linda was the one who saw things clearly. Peter Young is lucky to have such a brilliant son. He can just sit back and enjoy life. You really have to visit the cemetery. The Young family is blessed. Peter, when you make it big, don't forget about us folks in the small town. Looking at their faces, I found it incredibly laughable. Linda's mother, on the other hand, was beaming with pride. She had been ridiculed by many in the small town for marrying her younger daughter to me, but now she had finally come out on top. After arriving, I began placing flowers and candles for our ancestors. Just as I was about to ask my son to kneel and bow his head in respect a few times, Chen's mother, Linda Lee, suddenly arrived. Before I could ask her what she was doing, she sized up our ancestors' resting place with a disdainful look. Peter Young, they say the Young family is blessed. I don't see it. Whatever blessing there is probably isn't coming from your side. She glanced at me mockingly, a smug look on her face. My son stood to the side, ready to kneel and bow his head in respect to our ancestors, but Linda Lee grabbed him. Oh, my precious grandson. How can you kneel? You're a genius from Stanford University's early entrance program. What if you hurt your head kneeling? She looked at my son's head with concern, then glared at me, full of anger. You can kneel to your ancestors yourself. How dare you make Ethan do it? Is that something he should be doing? My Linda's mother, being honest, tried to smooth things over. All right, grandson, you don't have to kneel. Just stand there for a moment. Only then did Linda Lee reveal a satisfied smile. She meant to have calmed down, but she still didn't return to her own ancestors' plot. She stood right next to my son, secretly taking his hand while we were busy praying to our ancestors. Then, she whispered something in my son's ear. After a while, my son suddenly shouted, "I don't want to." I looked over and saw that Linda Lee had gone too far, trying to drag him away despite his struggles. I immediately rushed forward and snatched my son from her grasp. Linda Lee, what do you think you're doing? My son was shaken by the pulling and tugging. Once he came to his senses, he immediately complained to me. Dad, she wants me to kneel at their family plot. 3. As soon as he said this, a hint of guilt appeared on Linda Lee's face. My Linda's mother, hearing this, exploded. Linda Lee, what are you up to? Is this your child? You want him to kneel and bow his head to your ancestors? You told me not to let my grandson kneel to the Young family ancestors. I thought you were doing it for his own good, but you actually wanted him to kneel to your ancestors. Does the Chen family even deserve such a genius? My Linda's mother had probably been holding back since earlier. Seeing Linda Lee trying to do this now, she ignited her anger. After she finished speaking, she started panting heavily. My son, being sensible, saw his grandmother like this and proactively went forward to pat her back and massage her shoulders. Linda Lee jumped up and down when she saw this. Linda, how can you be so shameless? You're letting Ethan massage your shoulders. Don't you know he's 9 years old now? You don't even try to avoid suspicion. Is he even your grandson? She was so anxious that she blurted everything out. I want to massage my grandmother's shoulders. It's my pleasure, and it's none of your business, my son said crisply. That's right. Look at yourself. You want him to kneel at your family plot? You're not worthy. He's the child my daughter gave to the Young family, not to the Chen F. Emily, my Linda's mother retorted. As soon as she finished speaking, Linda Lee's eyes welled up with tears of grievance. She must have been truly upset. Seeing that my son refused to pay her any attention, she secretly spat at my Linda's mother and me, then looked expectantly at the bottom of the hills. After all the rituals were finished, I was about to have my son bow his head in respect one last time before we went down the hills. Suddenly, a familiar voice came from the side. Ethan, don't kneel. Those aren't your ancestors. As soon as the voice fell, I turned around and saw Susan Miller and Chen. They were still wearing the same clothes as in my previous life, looking refined, as if they were superior beings. I glanced at Linda Lee, and she was indeed wearing a smug smile. This person definitely knew about Susan Miller's faked death. The people around us heard the commotion at our family plot and all crowded around. My Linda's mother, standing behind me, recognized the person in front of her and her eyes reddened. She trembled as she walked up to Susan Miller and gently touched her face. Susan, you're still alive. Tears streamed down Linda's mother's face. Susan Miller started to cry as well when she saw this. Mom, it's Susan. Daughter is sorry. Seeing Susan Miller resurrected, Linda's mother was extremely excited, but after turning to look at my son and me, she quickly calmed down. Susan Miller, arm in arm with Frank Chen, came to stand in front of me. Frank Chen was the first to speak. Peter Young, I didn't expect you to be so good at raising children. You've raised my son so well. However, Ethan is older now and should be with his biological parents. We've been separated for so long, it's time for our family of 3 to reunite. 4. Susan Miller's eyes also reddened. She gave me a complicated look, then took my son's hand. Ethan, I'm your mother. I'm sorry, you've suffered all these years. After she finished speaking, she turned to look at me, her eyes still filled with complex emotions. You've raised Ethan very well, but it's better for a child to be with his biological parents. As for you, I'll give you some money as compensation for your efforts over the years. She then took out her phone from her pocket, seemingly planning to transfer money to me on the spot. My son turned to look at me for help, as if asking me if this was true. Frank Chen, on the other hand, wiped the tears from Susan Miller's face with a look of heartache. All right, today is a great day for our reunion. Don't cry. Then, he turned to look at me mockingly. Didn't you hear what Susan said? Ethan is my child. You're just a fool. Now that we're back, it's time for you to return our son to us. The villagers nearby widened their eyes when they heard his words, looking back and forth between us. Slap! Suddenly, my usually silent Linda's mother jumped out and slapped Susan Miller hard across the face. The crisp sound of the slap echoed, and Susan Miller looked at Linda's mother in disbelief. Mom? Why did you hit me? Linda's mother stared at her intently. Ethan is really your child with Frank Chen? Susan Miller nodded, tears in her eyes. Mom, it's true. Back then, Frank and anyway, Ethan must come back to us. Before she could finish speaking, Frank Chen and Linda Lee rushed forward to snatch the child. Susan Miller gave me a look of pity. Peter, I'll compensate you. My son struggled desperately, and I was about to step forward and pull him behind me. But then I saw a fierce look on Frank Chen's face, and in the next second, he shoved me hard. Just before I was about to fall, a pair of soft hands caught me. Seeing the familiar face, Susan Miller immediately realized what was happening. Shirley, what are you doing here? The people around us saw Shirley Sue and immediately crowded around her. Everyone knew Shirley Sue was a well-known and sought-after businesswoman. If they could get on her good side, getting a better job would be a piece of cake. Shirley Sue ignored the villagers' fawning faces and looked directly at Susan Miller. Susan Miller met her sister's cold gaze and unconsciously flinched. She still couldn't accept that the little girl who used to follow her around with a silly grin had now become such a cold woman. Remembering how good their relationship used to be, Susan Miller still moved closer to her sister. She tentatively took her sister's hand. Shirley, Ethan is really Frank's and my child. Back then, Frank and I were deeply in love, but Mom didn't approve of us being together and wanted me to marry Peter Young. I originally thought I would just live with it, but then I found out I was pregnant with Frank's child. I had no choice but to leave. I've made some money outside these years. As long as Peter Young is willing to return Ethan to us, I can give him money as compensation. After saying this, Susan Miller looked at Shirley Sue expectantly. But Shirley Sue didn't move, only looking at her coldly. I looked at Susan Miller indifferently. What right do you have to want Ethan? We're Ethan's biological parents. Hearing this, I couldn't help but laugh. I stared at Susan Miller intently, saying, word by word, Ethan isn't your biological child. 5. I glanced at Susan Miller and Frank Chen mockingly. Peter, I know you're upset and don't want to accept the truth, but Ethan is Frank's and my child. I'm definitely not lying about that, Susan Miller explained to me, then took Ethan's hand, trying to take him away. However, this time, Shirley Sue directly blocked her. He's not your son. He's my son. Shirley Sue looked at her sister, who had been dead for 10 years, with a frown. Your son? Susan Miller said with a confused frown. Then, as if she had realized something, she relaxed her brows and said, I know Mom was afraid Peter Young wouldn't be able to take care of Ethan, so she had you marry Peter Young to take care of him. You've worked hard all these years, but now that I'm back, I'll fulfill my responsibilities as a mother. You can get married too, Shirley. How ridiculous. She was dead for 10 years. She wasn't there when the child needed a mother the most. Now that the child was grown and had a promising future, they jumped out. Susan Miller looked at her sister with some guilt. Shirley Sue's brow furrowed even more when she heard her thanks. Susan Miller, are you crazy? I told you, he's my son, Peter's and my son. His name is Ethan Young. Susan Miller's face darkened. How would I not know if he's my son? Shirley Sue, I'm grateful that you helped me take care of Ethan for a few years, but Ethan is Frank's and my child. Today is Memorial Day. Let Ethan recognize his ancestors and kneel at the Chen family plot today. After she finished speaking, she tried to bypass Shirley Sue and directly drag Ethan towards the Chen family plot. Ethan, be good. Mom and Dad are sorry, but it's okay. Mom will make it up to you later. Frank Chen followed, staring intently at his son, tears welling up in his eyes. If you didn't know the situation, they would really seem like parents longing for their child. The son looked at them, a little scared, and hid behind Shirley Sue. Mom, who are they? Why do they say I'm their son? I'm clearly Mom and Dad's son. Shirley Sue also protectively shielded her son. Seeing the situation, I stood in front of them as well. Hearing Ethan call Shirley Sue Mom, Susan Miller's tears fell with a plop. Ethan, I'm your mom. I finally couldn't hold back anymore. Ethan is Shirley's and my child. He's the child Shirley gave birth to. I've made it so clear. Can't you understand? As for your son, he's already dead. 6. Hearing this, Susan Miller's face was struck by lightning. How could you have a son with Shirley? You said you only loved me. You're lying to me, right? How could Ethan be dead? Isn't he doing well? Frank Chen also looked disbelieving. He looked at the people around him, and their eyes were filled with pity. Susan Miller panicked a little, but she forced herself to calm down. Peter, I know you can't accept the truth, but you can't curse Ethan. Besides, you loved me so much. How could you be with Shirley? You said you would only love me in this lifetime. Her eyes revealed a glimmer of hope, as if waiting for me to say the answer she wanted to hear. I turned around and took Shirley Sue's hand, interlocking our fingers. Ethan is Shirley's and my child. Not only do I know it, but everyone in the small town knows it. You can ask Mom if you don't believe me. As for your and Frank Chen's child, if you don't believe me, I can take you to him, as long as you can handle it. Susan Miller was stunned. Frank Chen shouted in disbelief, impossible. Ethan is Susan's and my child. Everyone sighed. I simply turned around. Come with me. Susan Miller looked at Linda's mother for help, her eyes filled with tears. Go and take a look. In the end, it's all your fault, Linda's mother said, disappointed. Susan Miller had no choice but to follow Shirley Sue and me. Frank Chen, realizing what was happening, followed closely behind. When they arrived and saw the child's grave with their own eyes, Frank Chen was thunderstruck. He rushed to the front of the resting place, trying to see the name on it. After seeing it clearly, he shouted in despair. No, impossible. My son is a student at Stanford University's early entrance program. He's the most promising. How could he be dead? This is definitely fake. Not only did Frank Chen not believe it, but Susan Miller also didn't believe it at all. The way she looked at me had an added hint of sadness. Ethan quietly stood in front of me, trying to protect me with his small body. My heart warmed. Indeed, marrying Shirley Sue and having a son was the best decision I had ever made. My son was incredibly considerate to me, and Shirley Sue and I were a well-known loving couple in the small town. In my previous life, when Susan Miller and Frank Chen came back to claim their child, Ethan didn't immediately call them Mom and Dad. But in the end, when I slipped and fell from the hills, Ethan stood there without reacting at all. After being reborn, I naturally had a grudge against him. As a result, the day after I agreed to marry Shirley Sue, Ethan developed a high fever. The doctor said he had caught a cold before. It was too late to bring him in now. So, that Ethan from my previous life had died when he was barely a year old. The following year, Shirley Sue and I had a child, also a son. I still named him Ethan. Susan Miller refused to accept everything in front of her. She couldn't accept that her son was dead and that I had another son. Ignoring Frank Chen, who was still sitting blankly in front of the tombstone, she reached out to me. 7. Peter, this must be fake, right? You love me so much. You would have taken care of our child. You definitely wouldn't have pretended with Shirley. You have no feelings for each other. Our son is still doing well, right? I know I was wrong. Please don't lie to me like this anymore. I'll go back with you and we'll live a good life, okay? She looked at me with tearful eyes. I didn't say anything, only turning around to hold Shirley Sue's hand tightly. I originally thought that after the events of my previous life, I would never fall in love with anyone again. Even if I married Shirley Sue, it would only be to get revenge on Susan Miller. But I didn't expect Shirley Sue to be so good to me. She knew how to appreciate my efforts and was willing to work hard with me. We had endured those difficult days of earning money together. How could I not love her? My heart belonged to her completely. I didn't answer Susan Miller's question, but someone else did. Sister, I'm still calling you that. I hope you can wake up and see things clearly. The truth is what Peter said. If you hadn't faked your death and eloped with Frank Chen, I wouldn't have had the chance to marry Peter. Regardless, that child is indeed dead. You've already married Frank Chen. You should let go of your sadness and have another child. Shirley Sue spoke sincerely. It was clear she still had some feelings left for Susan Miller. But Susan Miller didn't listen at all. She opened and closed her mouth, wanting to say something, but Linda's mother interrupted her. Enough. Things have escalated to this point because of you, Susan. That child died because you didn't cover him with a blanket when you left. Susan Miller sneered when she heard this. Mom, do you think I don't know you favor Shirley? Why did you have Shirley marry Peter? Did you want me to die so you could treat Shirley well wholeheartedly? Hearing Susan Miller's words, I almost laughed out loud. Linda's mother favored Shirley Sue? If she really favored Shirley Sue, she wouldn't have had Shirley Sue marry me. Shirley Sue was only 19 years old when she married me, the prime of her youth. She hadn't even been in a relationship before. She was only married to me, a divorced man with a child, because Linda's mother felt sorry that her eldest daughter's child had no one to take care of him. Not to mention that Shirley Sue and I were previously sister-in-law and brother-in-law. Just the fact that I had a child meant that I was definitely not a match for Shirley Sue in other people's eyes. If Shirley Sue hadn't liked me, she probably wouldn't have been happy in this lifetime. Linda's mother clearly favored Susan Miller. Indeed, the light in Linda's mother's eyes completely disappeared after hearing Susan Miller's words. All these years, she had believed Susan Miller was really dead. After learning that the only bloodline Susan Miller had left behind had also died, she spent her days in tears. If Shirley Sue and I hadn't had a child the following year, she might have passed away early. To commemorate that child, she took out her retirement money, disregarding the traditions of our hometown. She insisted on burying Susan Miller and that child next to each other, even erecting a tombstone for the child who had died young. Many people in the small town thought she was crazy. After all, there were too many children who died young in the small town. They could just be buried anywhere. Why go to so much trouble? After all these years of affection being wasted, Linda's mother couldn't help but cry sadly. All right, I've already taken you to the grave. You know everything. Shirley, Ethan, and I are going down the hills. Mom, come with us. As I said this, I turned around, wanting to go down the hills. 8. But Susan Miller just wouldn't let us pass. She stared at me intently, saying with a hint of sadness, "Didn't you say you wouldn't be moved by any other woman besides me? Why? Why did you pretend with Shirley?" Frank Chen's face was as black as the bottom of a pot. I snorted. I was only 22 years old when you faked your death and eloped with Frank Chen. How could I not marry a wife? But Susan Miller still asked persistently, we had so many memories together. How could you easily forget them and be with her? Frank Chen's face was no different from the bottom of a pot. I looked at her with a sneer. When you eloped with Frank Chen, didn't you think about the memories we had? Besides, you didn't love me at all. Otherwise, why would you have run away with Frank Chen? As soon as I said this, Susan Miller's face changed colors. She wanted to say something, but Frank Chen couldn't bear it any longer. A flash of viciousness passed through his eyes. Susan Miller, we're married now, and you're still thinking about him? Do you know that our child was most likely killed by him? After saying this, he immediately wanted to drag Susan Miller down the hills. They had reappeared in order to bring their child back. But seeing this situation, Frank Chen immediately realized something was wrong. If he didn't take Susan Miller away now, he was afraid that not only would he lose his son, but he would also lose his wife to someone else. But as soon as his hand reached out, Susan Miller slapped it away without hesitation. Seeing the red mark on the back of his hand, a hint of anger flashed in Frank Chen's eyes, and then his face turned red. Before they came back, Susan Miller would have felt extremely sorry if he had even a small scratch on his body. She would have wanted to take his place. But now, she didn't care at all. Frank Chen glared at me fiercely, his eyes filled with unconcealed hatred. Shirley Sue frowned. She really hadn't expected that her sister, who had died 10 years ago and been resurrected, would still have such thoughts about me. She said somewhat irritably, "Susan Miller, I've already been more than fair to you. You were the one who did shameless things first. Now you're back to steal my son, and when you couldn't, you wanted to steal my husband. How can you be so shameless?" Hearing Shirley Sue's words, Susan Miller's eyes instantly turned red. She stared at me blankly, tears falling like water. "Peter Young, can you really forget me? I don't believe it. You said you only loved me." I reached out and interrupted Susan Miller. "You've already made your choice and gotten Frank Chen. Cherish the person beside you." I sarcastically pointed at Frank Chen to remind her. "Frank Chen is the love of your life, the one you abandoned your husband and son for. Think about it." After speaking, I ignored Susan Miller's attempts to stop me, took Shirley's hand, and went down the hills with my son. 9. I thought that Memorial Day meeting would be the last time I saw Susan Miller. After all, if she had any decency left, she shouldn't bother me again. But unexpectedly, only a day passed before I encountered her again in my front yard. Susan Miller was wearing an evening gown today, and her flowing hair made her look no different from when she had just married me. Seeing me appear, she stood up a brew. "PTLY. You're finally back, Peter Young." She bit her lip, looking at me pitifully, her eyes full of pain and expectation. "I know I was wrong to you before, but now I know I was wrong. You'll forgive me, won't you? After all, you love me so much. You're with Shirley now just to make me jealous." I subconsciously took 2 steps back. I really couldn't understand why Susan Miller could be so shameless. I rubbed my head, feeling the pain return. "Susan Miller, what exactly do you want? We're over. Can't you understand that? Why do you keep dwelling on whether I love you or not?" "Fine, I'll tell you again, I don't love you. I don't love you anymore, okay? Even if you get the answer you want from me, then what? You'll divorce Frank Chen, I'll divorce Shirley, and then we'll be together again?" As soon as I finished speaking, Susan Miller stepped forward with a face full of joy. "Yes, that's how it should be. We should be together." Looking at the expression on her face, I realized that Susan Miller really thought that way. I thought Susan Miller was just unwilling because she knew that Shirley and I were married and truly together. I didn't expect that such an outrageous idea had actually popped into her head. I hurried away from her. "Susan Miller, are you crazy? Have you forgotten what you did? You clearly loved Frank Chen so much that you were willing to fake your death and abandon your husband and son to be with him. Now that you've finally gotten your wish, you want to divorce him instead?" I said in disbelief. I really thought Susan Miller was crazy. Originally, I died in my previous life because I slipped and fell down the hills. Although it had something to do with Susan Miller and Frank Chen, it wasn't much. So in this life, I thought about slapping them in the face on Memorial Day. After letting them suffer the pain of losing their son and the feeling of dashed hopes, we could be completely free. But I never expected that Susan Miller still had feelings for me. If she really loved me, then why did she fake her death and get together with Chen? No matter what, I couldn't figure it out. Yes, I chose Chen, but after I gave up everything to be with him, I realized that I might not love him that much. Not only that, but after Chen and I got married for 2 years, he started hitting me after getting drunk one time, and he's been hitting me for 8 years now. Susan Miller shed tears and pulled up the sleeves of her clothes. I clearly saw the old and new scars on her arms, and there were even cigarette burns. The newest wound was probably inflicted by Chen after returning from the hills yesterday, and it was still faintly bleeding. Although I felt a little pity after seeing it, I still said firmly, "You made your choice 10 years ago, so these things have nothing to do with me. Besides, why do you think I would want a woman like you?" I looked into her eyes and said seriously, "Susan Miller, you're an adult. You should understand that there's no turning back. Go back. If Chen hits you, you should divorce him, not come to me. I will only be with Shirley for the rest of my life. I've already promised her." Susan Miller walked away with a pale face, red eyes, and disappointment. I had a feeling that she shouldn't bother me anymore. 10. There was, of course, a reason why Linda's mother didn't agree with Susan Miller and Chen being together back then. Leaving aside Chen's extremely difficult mother, Chen himself was no good. He was a well-known gambler in the small town. At a young age, he was already proficient in all forms of gambling, except that Susan Miller was blinded by the filter of first love. No one was willing to marry him. And now that Chen had moved back to the small town, he naturally became the gambler he used to be again. Or rather, he had never changed. He was still not just a small-time gambler. In the 10 years, Chen had probably gambled behind Susan Miller's back many times, and he probably didn't have any money left. After the Memorial Day incident, Chen had no hope. Susan Miller also showed her goodwill to me in front of him. He could have gotten a son studying in Stanford University's early entrance program for nothing, but he wasn't his own. Not only was Linda Lee furious, but Chen also got drunk every night and eventually placed all his hopes on gambling. It was a pity that gambling was almost always a losing proposition. He lost all his money and even owed a lot of people money. After losing, he went back and vented his anger on Susan Miller. When he hit Susan Miller before, no one would care even if she cried out outside. But after returning to the small town, not only would Chen hit her, but Linda Lee would also hit her after discovering that her son didn't care about Susan Miller at all and that Susan Miller had nowhere to go. Susan Miller was beaten and cried almost every day. After a long time, Linda's mother couldn't stand it anymore. After all, she was a piece of flesh that had fallen from her body. She looked at me cautiously. "I want to help Susan Miller. I know she did something wrong, but it hurts my heart to see her being beaten like that every day." 2 lines of tears flowed down her face. I sighed. "Help her, but giving her money won't do any good. Let me find her a lawyer. Let her get a divorce and live far away, and don't come back." Linda's mother nodded with relief. "That's good. You and Shirley should live well. I won't let Susan Miller bother you again." In the evening, after Shirley Sue came back, I told her about it directly. After all, Susan Miller was still her sister, even though they had already become like this. The blood ties in their bones could not be severed. As expected, Shirley Sue didn't say anything, but she still nodded. The next day, she helped Susan Miller find a lawyer and also had someone beat up Chen. After successfully divorcing, Susan Miller wanted to see us one more time. But both Shirley and I felt that there was no need for us to meet again. So in the end, Susan Miller went far away, and we never met again. The days passed slowly like this, and the things of the previous life were slowly healed in the happiness of this life. Now, when I think back, I can smile faintly. Life is short, cherish every spring, cherish every moment of love.